It's no secret that healthcare is a disaster. In the United States, healthcare is a complete mess. Have you ever considered that healthcare is the only industry where we added technology and made things worse? We added technology and made things less efficient and more expensive. Healthcare technology in the United States is driven top down by insurance companies and regulators who never considered what doctors need or what would benefit patients. Doctors are forced to use technology that they never had any say in designing, and they're so frustrated, you'll actually hear doctors saying they wish they could throw it all out and go back to paper. That's how frustrated they've become, and that's the opportunity. Welcome to HIPAA for Startups. My name is Michael Herrick, and if you're an entrepreneur looking to leverage technology to solve some of these intractable problems in healthcare, this training is for you. Healthcare is ripe for innovation and disruption, but there's a little thing called HIPAA that scares a lot of entrepreneurs away from the industry. HIPAA is, of course, the health data privacy law in the United States that controls how you must protect and safeguard healthcare data about patients that you collect. HIPAA requires you to have good cybersecurity controls in place and secure technology to protect that data. If your customers and your investors haven't already said so, you can expect to hear it from them soon. HIPAA compliance is a must. They're looking for you to build a product, build a solution, to build a company that is fully HIPAA compliant. And in this training, I'm going to show you how to deal with all of these things at your new company or your new product. For starters, I just want to let you know that all of these things that I've just talked about, every single one of these facts that we all know, are all wrong, or at least they're not the whole story. And during this training, I'm going to give you the whole story, help you understand HIPAA, help you understand what you've got to do, what you don't have to do. I want you to apply HIPAA correctly at your organization and effectively and strategically. Now, this is a bold claim, putting up the big red wrong right on the screen here, right at the beginning of the presentation. Let me tell you a little bit about my background so you understand where I'm coming from. I'm not speaking to you as somebody who's worked at the Department of Health and Human Services for 30 years. I'm not a bureaucrat. I'm not a regulator. I'm not a policy wonk. I'm an entrepreneur like you. I'm an entrepreneur. I started my first company in 1992. I've been building technology companies ever since. I'm also a software developer. These days, I focus more on architecture and strategy, but I've written hundreds of lines of code in my career. So I understand the business and I understand the challenges that you're facing starting up your new health technology product. Launched a number of healthcare products over the years. One of the products that I'm most proud of is a product down in Mexico, actually, a product called MediCheck. It's an electronic health record system built for the Latin American healthcare system. Now, of course, there's no HIPAA in Mexico, but even so, we follow all of the HIPAA standards. Our customers expect it, our doctors expect it, our patients expect it. HIPAA is a US law, but it's also an international standard for security and privacy, and so we adhere to that. I do a lot of consulting with startups, helping them with their HIPAA risk management strategy. I do a lot of work as a virtual compliance officer, a virtual chief information security officer. So that's the background that I'm bringing here, is the background of an entrepreneur looking to get things done and get products launched. And I don't want HIPAA to stand in your way of the innovation that you have in mind. So let's take a look at these three pseudo facts that I've been talking about. HIPAA, there's this misconception that HIPAA controls healthcare data, and any type of organization that has any kind of healthcare data has to protect that data or risk the ire of HIPAA. Not completely true. HIPAA does not control healthcare data. It controls certain specific healthcare companies under a very specific definition. You might possibly be collecting healthcare data, but if you don't fit the definition of a healthcare company as defined by HIPAA, HIPAA might not even apply to you. Some of the folks taking this training may come through and find out that they don't even have to worry about HIPAA. Now, it is very true that HIPAA does have specific requirements for the technology that you're going to implement, for the security controls that you're going to implement at your organization. But the reason I call this a myth is a lot of companies and a lot of technology companies jump into this too soon. HIPAA really requires, as a foundation, good planning and documentation. It's the planning and documentation that forms the foundation of your risk management strategy and what determines how you're going to apply the secure technology that HIPAA requires. And you've heard me talk a couple of times already about HIPAA risk management. And that's the mindset I want to get you into. I want to get out of this HIPAA compliance mindset. Folks, there's really no such thing as HIPAA compliant. People come to me all the time and they say, we need to make our product HIPAA compliant. Make me HIPAA compliant. I hate to break it to you folks, there's just no such thing as HIPAA compliant. It's a marketing buzzword. It's not a real thing. There's no HIPAA certification that you can achieve. Nobody can sign off on your systems and affirm that you are HIPAA compliant, all right? Nobody's handing out gold stars or going to pat you on the head and call you HIPAA compliant. There's just no such thing. And anybody who's trying to offer you a HIPAA seal of approval or a HIPAA compliant certification, they're selling snake oil. It's not a real thing under the law. And you know what, folks? It's a good thing. It's a good thing. Let's move beyond this compliance mentality. That's what worries people. They feel like HIPAA is a whole bunch of rules that they've got to follow exactly, and one little slip up is going to cause disaster at your organization. Not exactly. There's not a bunch of check marks that you can check off and achieve HIPAA compliance. I want you, and during this training, I'm going to help you start thinking. I want you to think about a HIPAA risk management strategy. Again, there's no checklist. There's nothing that we can do that will say you do these things and you are now HIPAA compliant. That doesn't exist, and that can be nerve-wracking for some people who just want to check the boxes and move on. But actually, from an entrepreneur's standpoint, this is actually a great way to approach it. This is much more flexible and gives you the power to make business-focused decisions at your organization. Business and risk management decisions, not compliance decisions. Compliance, I don't know about you, but I didn't start my own company because I liked following rules. I didn't start my own company because I like compliance. But when we're talking about risk management, hey, now we're talking the language of business. We're talking the language of startups. This is something we can work with, and we're going to talk about that during this training. Let's back up and do a little bit of alphabet soup analysis here. So just make sure that we've got all of our vocab in place. Obviously, we're talking about HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. That law was passed way back in 1996, and things have changed a lot since then. And when we say HIPAA, we're actually referring to more than just that one law. There was the High-Tech Act, there's the Omnibus regulations, even the Affordable Care Act, a number of other laws and regulations. And HIPAA has just become sort of the buzzword, the shorthand phrase for referring to an entire landscape of legislation, regulation, and best practices. We just call it all HIPAA for convenience. But it's more complicated than that if you're a lawyer or a compliance officer. But we're just going to go ahead and keep referring to all of that as HIPAA. HIPAA is about protected health information, and specifically electronic protected health information, or EPHI. So we'll talk about that a lot, about how PHI comes into your organization and how you protect PHI at your organization. HIPAA is overseen by the Department of Health and Human Services at the U.S. federal government, and specifically within HHS by the Office of Civil Rights, OCR. They're the ones who investigate and sanction data breaches. Now, that should catch your attention. That's very interesting. The reason it's the Office of Civil Rights is because patient privacy is a civil right that we all enjoy in this country. That's how seriously our government takes this. A data breach at your health tech startup, it's not just bad PR, and it's not just an inconvenience for your customers. A data breach is downright un-American, and it will be investigated as a civil rights violation. That's how seriously we have to take this. There are two types of healthcare companies that are subject to HIPAA. First is referred to as a covered entity. Covered entities are hospitals, doctors' offices, physicians' practices, health insurance companies, people who are directly involved in the mission of care and who are billing health insurance. Those are covered entities directly subject to HIPAA. Also subject to HIPAA, and some of you at this training might be a covered entity. Actually, providing healthcare and billing for healthcare. But a lot of you are probably business associates. You're not yourself a covered entity, but your customers and your clients, your users are covered entities. And in order for those people, for these hospitals or healthcare practices that you're doing business with, in order for you to do business with them, in order for them to send you patient data, they're going to require you to sign a business associate agreement. And so we're going to talk about all of that and how business associate agreements work. When we're talking about all of this alphabet soup and all these buzzwords, there's one thing that's just the most important thing. If you learn nothing else during this training, I want you to know how to spell HIPAA, for crying out loud. I can't tell you how often I go into a practice or a hospital or see something on a website and I see HIPAA spelled with 2 P's. All right, HIPAA has 1 P and 2 A's. So whether you remember what all those letters stand for, at least let's remember how many P's and A's we have in HIPAA. There's nothing that makes you look ignorant and uninformed about your obligations than not even knowing how to spell the law. So let's talk about these healthcare companies that are subject to HIPAA, and let me help you figure out which one you might be, if either. So the first question is, are you a covered entity? Are you, under the law, directly subject to HIPAA as a covered entity? Now, like I said, this is usually hospitals, healthcare practices, people providing healthcare and billing for healthcare. This is a link to a flow chart that asks some questions and walks you through to help you determine whether or not you are a covered entity. But I'm going to make it really simple. It's really the first 2 questions on the flow chart that are usually the most relevant. First of all, are you collecting healthcare data? You probably wouldn't be here at this training unless you're pretty sure that you're collecting healthcare data. So we'll call that a yes. And then the very second question is, do you electronically transmit covered health insurance transactions? Are you billing health insurance? Are you doing so electronically? Because if you're not billing health insurance, you are not a covered entity. HIPAA does not apply directly to you. HIPAA does not cover any kind of healthcare data, however it's being collected and whoever collects it. It only protects healthcare data when it's being collected by a covered entity who bills insurance transactions electronically. If you're not billing for insurance, you are not a covered entity. You might have HIPAA obligations the other way, though. If your customers, if your clients or users are covered entities, they may ask you to sign a business associate agreement. So you might be a business associate. This is really easy. Are you receiving PHI from a covered entity? And did your customer have you sign a business associate agreement? If you signed a business associate agreement, or if you're planning to sign a business associate agreement, your customers may require this as a condition for doing business with them. That makes you a HIPAA business associate, and that's what signs you up. That's what puts you on the HIPAA hook. Most of my clients are business associates, and they come to me because they've got to deal with those obligations that they inherit through this business associate agreement. We're going to talk a little bit later in the training more specifics about how a business associate agreement works. But this is the second way that you can become liable and subject to HIPAA. If neither one of these things applies to you, you might not be subject to HIPAA. I mean, first of all, some folks are not really collecting healthcare data as it's defined. You know, fitness trackers and some wellness applications sometimes are not considered healthcare data. So you don't even meet the first criteria. You might not be a covered entity. And again, remember, if you're not billing to health insurance, if you're not actually sending electronic transactions to health insurance companies for reimbursement, then you're not a covered entity. And if you haven't signed a business associate agreement, you're not a business associate either. If you're receiving data directly from consumers and they're giving you their data, you might not be either a covered entity or a business associate. Generally, you're only going to be on the hook if you're a covered entity or if you're receiving PHI from covered entities under a business associate agreement. So, hey, some of you this might be great news. Some of you may be discovering for the first time that actually HIPAA isn't relevant. HIPAA does not apply to you. That HIPAA is not something that you have to worry about from a legal perspective. Well, don't touch that dial. Hang on, because even if you're not legally obligated to follow HIPAA, it's probably a really good idea from a business point of view, from a risk management point of view, and from a public relations point of view to follow as much of the HIPAA requirements as are appropriate for your organization. So we're going to talk about that too. But let's start by let's break down HIPAA a little bit. HIPAA breaks down into 3 components. We call them the privacy rule, the security rule, and the breach notification rule. Privacy, who can you share data with and when and how do you document that? Security rule, this is what people usually think about when they think about HIPAA. They think about all of the security requirements, the encryption that's required, the password management that's required, things like that. And that's just one part of HIPAA under the security rule. There's also a breach notification rule. If you become aware of a security incident or a breach of protected health information, you've got to report it. You might have to report it to patients, to clients. You might even have to report it to the Department of Health and Human Services or even to the press. Anybody who's a covered entity or a business associate has to follow all of HIPAA. Some of the privacy rule doesn't apply to business associates so much. The breach notification rule might change a little bit for business associates. Everybody's got to follow the security rule. Like I say, that's the part that people think of as being all about HIPAA. So if you're a covered entity or a business associate, you've got to follow all of this stuff. And if you don't, there is enforcement action that can come after you. It can come after you as a business associate or as a covered entity. I mentioned already the Office of Civil Rights. They're the ones who investigate at the federal level. State attorneys general are also empowered to enforce HIPAA in their states. So state attorneys general are some of the enforcement action that you could be facing if you don't follow your HIPAA obligations. There's even possibilities for private auditors to come in and audit you. We've seen whistleblower actions, and all kinds of things can lead to HIPAA enforcement action. It can be very bad if you're a business associate or a covered entity. If you're not actually a business associate or a covered entity, well, you don't have to worry about this stuff. But does that really mean you got nothing at all to worry about? Well, I don't think so. You may not be legally obligated to follow the HIPAA guidelines. And if you violate HIPAA, maybe you're not going to be investigated by the Department of Health and Human Services. But still, HIPAA is, as I said before, it's an international standard that's recognized in the community, and it's even recognized by the public. And so I advise my clients who don't have specific legal obligations to voluntarily adopt as much of HIPAA as you can, as much of HIPAA as is appropriate. Now, the privacy rule is, you're not going to have the specific requirements under HIPAA, but still, you can't play fast and loose with your customers' data. That's going to lead to bad things down the road for you. So you've got to be thinking about privacy considerations. Breach notification. You might have breach notification requirements, maybe not under HIPAA, but you might have breach notification requirements under state law. Most states in our country now have a data breach notification law that you're going to have to follow. And then the security rule. This is what people really come to me for. And I recommend that even if you're not legally obligated to follow the security rule, go ahead, voluntarily adopt the security standards of the security rule. Those security standards, that's what you'll be judged by. If not in actual court, you'll be judged by them in the court of public opinion. So even wherever you are in your legal obligations, this is the framework you want to work within to meet your HIPAA obligations. So let's talk about the HIPAA security rule. HIPAA has a whole bunch of security rules that you're supposed to follow. They're referred to as HIPAA implementable specifications. And you've probably seen these. You've probably looked these up and wondered how you're gonna deal with all of this. You can actually find all of the HIPAA specifications on our website. This is a free tool that we make available to you. Just go to hipaa.host/specs, and you can see all of the HIPAA implementable specifications broken down into the administrative, the organizational, the physical, and the technical. These are the standards that you're required to implement or at least address in your solution and at your company. And this can be very intimidating for people who are coming at it from a compliance mindset, that you've got to deal with all of these things, you've got to do all of these things. Not necessarily. HIPAA does not require heroic measures. HIPAA does not require you to do every single thing that's on that list, and there's a lot of flexibility on how you implement the implementable specifications. And what's going to be appropriate for one company is going to be different for another company. No heroic measures. You're aiming for what's reasonable and appropriate for the size, the nature, and yes, even the budget of your organization. What's appropriate for a small software startup who's collecting tens of thousands of patient records is very different from what's reasonable and appropriate for a large health insurance company with millions of member lives in their database. No heroic measures. Let's go for what's reasonable and appropriate. How do you decide what that is? How do you determine what's reasonable and appropriate for your organization? That's where planning and documentation comes in. Before you start building anything, before you go off and start implementing technology and spinning up servers and programming, you've got to have a plan and you've got to document that plan, because under HIPAA, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So you've got to have planning and documentation in place first. There's a standard business and risk management tool that is designed for exactly this, and it's called a risk assessment. A risk assessment is required by HIPAA, and it's the foundation of your risk management strategy. Everything starts with the risk assessment. Now, a risk assessment is simply a proactive, enterprise-wide look at all of the systems at your organization, at all of the ways that PHI, protected health information, can come in, how the ways that you receive or create PHI, and how PHI moves through your organization from one system to another. Every step of the way, what are the security controls that you have in place to protect that PHI? All of that is identified and documented in a risk assessment. A risk assessment is also a time for looking for areas for improvement, looking for opportunities where you can make improvements to your security, looking for gaps, looking for weaknesses in your systems that could be exploited to cause a data breach. How can you patch those gaps and make improvements to your security posture? And because it's all lined up to business concept, the business concept of risk, it's not just about technology, it's about business risk. That's what enables you to set priorities and make a plan for moving forward, that a plan that will effectively put your limited time and resources to its most effective, most impactful use. As I said, a risk assessment is required by HIPAA. It's the very first thing that a HIPAA auditor would ask for if there's ever a data breach at your organization. All right, they're not going to dive right into the technology. They're not going to ask you about your encryption. They're not going to ask to see your penetration test. The very first thing they're going to ask for is your HIPAA risk assessment. And unfortunately, lots of companies skip this step, dive right into the technology, don't have this stuff documented, and when they're asked for a risk assessment, they don't have a good answer. And that's what can lead to these business-killing fines that you might be seeing in the news. Crippling HIPAA fines, almost always tied to the lack of a risk assessment. Here's an example. Here's a provider up in Colorado. They suffered a phishing attack through an email phishing attack. Can happen to anybody. And breached 3,200 patient records, and it led to a whopper of a fine, $400,000 fine for this nonprofit health clinic. What you'll see in these news releases, there's a link here to the press release. Every time there's a breach, HHS issues a press release bragging about the killer fine that they've imposed and their findings, what went wrong. And the very first finding in all of these announcements is always the lack of a risk assessment. Yes, there were problems. Yes, there was a phishing attack and things like that. But the main thing that they cite, the main thing that they criticize, and is at the very top of their findings, is the lack of a risk assessment. Yes, you had a phishing attack, but when you don't even do a risk assessment, how could you know? You've got no way of preparing yourself or protecting yourself from what could go wrong. And if you don't have a risk assessment, you're just demonstrating reckless disregard for your obligations under the law. It's the lack of a risk assessment that racks up the fines. Lack of a risk assessment can turn a $10,000 fine into a $100,000 fine. Just that one factor. Even if you're not a covered entity or a business associate, you wouldn't be facing fines from Health and Human Services, but a risk assessment is still a great business process to go through for your organization. All right, this is a risk assessment is your plan and your roadmap, so that to ensure that you're building the right technology and that you're applying your resources most cost effectively, that you're not building stuff that's not actually going to help. You're focusing on technology and processes that's actually going to move the needle, that's actually going to help improve your security and compliance posture. That's your risk assessment that gives you that roadmap. A good risk assessment will save you money in the long run, but it's got to be complete. And this is where a lot of tech companies fall down. They focus just on their server or just on their application architecture, just on their cloud services, and they ignore the other people and processes that go into a full HIPAA risk management strategy. So a risk assessment needs to look at all systems. Yes, if you're building software, naturally you're going to be looking at how that software is built and where that software is hosted. But don't overlook your office technology, just your office IT, your workstations, your endpoints, your wireless network at the office. Don't overlook how people are trained, how people manage their passwords. Don't overlook those policy and procedure types of controls that because anybody can undo all of the beautiful technology that you build at your cloud hosting platform if you're not documenting your policies and training people to it. Vendor management is a big part of HIPAA risk management, and we're going to go into that in some detail here after we finish talking about the risk assessment. So it's important to look at everything here. And like I say, a lot of companies, there's this misconception that, hey, our server's HIPAA compliant and the server makes us HIPAA compliant. You've got to look at everything. One bad process can undo all of the great technology that you've built in your server environment. Once you've identified and inventoried all of the systems at your organization, it's time to start documenting all of the security controls that you have in place. And you can refer back to that website that I showed you earlier, HIPAA.host/specs, for all of the security controls that HIPAA requires you to consider and document on your systems. But here's a short list. Here's a short list of some of the HIPAA specifications that I like to really focus on when we're looking at healthcare software. If you're building healthcare software that's going to be storing and processing and transmitting PHI, these are some of the HIPAA specifications that I like to look at closely. These are some of the specs that commonly get overlooked and leave great risks and great vulnerabilities in a product. First of all, logging. I'd like to have a deep conversation on how access is logged in your solution. You should be logging unique user IDs, timestamps, and resources being accessed. Obviously, there's reasons for good logs just for being able to debug your product, for being able to identify and respond to security incidents. HIPAA also requires you to be able to respond in a very specific way to what's called a request for an accounting of disclosures. The HIPAA privacy rule gives patients the right to request that any covered entity give them a list of all of the people who accessed their patient records. I can go to my doctor and say, I want you to give me a list of every person who looked at my patient records. And that doctor might contact their business associate. They might contact you and say, and give you the same request. We need to know for this patient who looked at the records. And you've got to have logging that's sufficiently detailed to be able to say, these people in our organization had access to that record on this date, just so that you can meet that obligation to respond to a request for an accounting of disclosures. Login monitoring, also very important, so important that it's considered a separate specification under HIPAA. Just keeping track of login attempts, failed login attempts, things like that. It's a really good process to watch that and look for suspicious behavior in your login monitoring procedures. HIPAA is also, it's not just about privacy and security, it's also about availability. You've got to ensure that this healthcare data is available when the doctors, when the hospitals, when the patients need it. So that means that you've got to have good data backup plans in place. You've got to have a good data backup cycle. I like people to be able to go back at least 90 days, be able to restore backups going back at least 90 days is a good best practice for your HIPAA risk management plan, for your data backup plan on your HIPAA product. Also, data integrity controls, being able to detect, when data was changed, who changed it, ideally even being able to roll back changes to your data, being able to repair damaged data, being able to repair even malicious sabotage to your data is all covered under integrity controls. Access control is really one of the biggest risks at any custom software product. How are people logging in and gaining access to the product? This is where we see lots of vulnerabilities, and we'd like to focus on this a lot. How do you ensure that the people who are requesting access, who are requesting an account, who are asking you to reset a password, how do you ensure that it's the person you think it is? How do you conduct person and entity authentication. This isn't a technology question. This is a process question. How do you know that the person on the phone asking you to reset their password is the doctor that you think it is? You've got to have unique user identification. HIPAA very explicitly prohibits any kind of account sharing. Every single person logging into your system should be logging in under their own username, their own user ID. So your solution has to be able to support that. You've got to have good password management practices. You've got to make sure that you're just storing and managing passwords correctly with salted and hashed tables and things like that to minimize the potential impact of a breach of your credentials database. That's very important. Also, you've got to have plans for how, your password rules. What password rules are enforced by your product? What's your minimum length? What's your minimum complexity requirements and things like that? HIPAA requires you to have an inactivity timer. It doesn't specify how long that timer should be. It needs to be something reasonable. So after 20 minutes, after an hour, after 5 minutes, depending on your solution, if there's no user activity, your solution needs to log them off. That's a very specific requirement under HIPAA that you've got to deal with and you've got to implement. Encryption is an important one. Obviously, encryption is a great way to protect information. You should definitely be having encryption in transit every place. You should be using security certificates, SSL and TLS. There should be no unencrypted data. There's just no reason for that. It's very easy to set up nowadays. So encryption in transit is a must. Encryption at rest, encryption on hard drives and disks and devices and storage devices should be applied when it's appropriate. It's not always appropriate, and there's a misconception that HIPAA requires encryption everywhere. Not exactly true. I want to get into that a little bit later here. Talk about encryption a little bit. There's more though that you can go. You can go above and beyond, and you should go above and beyond what HIPAA requires. Remember, HIPAA is a pretty old law and doesn't cover all of the best practices that you want to implement at your organization. We really like to work from the cybersecurity guidelines from NIST, from the National Institute for Standards and Technology. You can find this also on our website, hipaa.host/specs. These are all of the cybersecurity controls recommended under NIST 800-53. It's sort of the cybersecurity Bible. These are all of the things, all of the different types of security controls that you can implement at an organization, at a solution. This one that we're looking at right here, this is unsuccessful logon attempts. And this is a great control that you should apply at your organization. It's not required by HIPAA, but it will improve your security. It will mitigate the risks to the data that you're collecting. If somebody logs in multiple times unsuccessfully, you should consider that suspicious, and you should disable that account, at least for a period of time, in response to that security incident. Another NIST document that I really like is NIST 800-63, and this is the NIST Digital Identity Guidelines, which is full of really interesting new evidence-based standards for how to manage passwords. There's some great stuff in here that you can look at. It's really interesting. When you look at the digital identity guidelines, you'll find out that NIST standards no longer recommend enforcing complexity rules, all that stuff about upper and lowercase letters and special characters and numbers. Research is showing that that stuff is not effective and can actually be counterproductive, no longer recommended by NIST, and has never been required by HIPAA. Also, NIST no longer recommends forcing people to change their passwords every 30 days or 60 days or 90 days. Again, not super effective, and in many cases, counterproductive. So consider this. There's an opportunity here to move beyond some of those old myths and security theater regarding passwords and start doing some real modern evidence-based password management. So some opportunities there for some cutting edge cybersecurity controls at your organization. Now, we see a lot of so-called risk assessments that look something like this. It's a spreadsheet with all of the controls, and we've got green cells and red cells, and green cells means you did it, and red means you didn't, and you need to. And we're starting to see pushback from HHS on this type of exercise. This was a case where somebody submitted a risk assessment, and they're like, guys, that's not a risk assessment. That is insufficient to meet the requirements of the security rule. I don't want you to think of these controls as a checklist and you've got to get all the checks in the right places. I want you to think of it as a toolbox full of different tools that you can pick from and choose to apply in order to mitigate a risk. I want you to identify realistic threats, realistic business risks to your data, and use these HIPAA specifications as your set of tools, your set of security controls that you can apply when it's reasonable and appropriate to mitigate those risks. If you don't do that, if you go at it from a compliance checklist sort of point of view, you can get yourself really backwards. You can end up with really misplaced priorities and misaligned incentives. I mentioned encryption earlier. Encryption at rest is a great way where people lose sight of the risk factor and they get so focused on getting compliance check marks in place that they do stuff that doesn't end up really helping. For example, encryption at rest on a server. Is that really helping? What risks are you worried about on your server environment that encrypting the disk is going to help you with? Really, realistically, not that many. Remember, encryption at rest is basically a physical security control, all right? Encryption at rest protects you if you're worried that somebody's going to walk into your data center and pull your server off the rack and walk off with it, right? Then encryption at rest protects you from that risk. That's not a very realistic risk. That's not something that we're really that concerned about. And the things that we are concerned about in that server environment, things like application vulnerabilities, zero-day exploits on the operating system, unpatched security tools, and things like that. Encryption doesn't protect you from any of those risks. So what's it really doing? What's encryption at rest doing, except if it's not mitigating any realistic risks and it's just complicating your systems? Is it worth doing? And then when you focus entirely on that and you focus on the server, and people love to focus on the server because they think, well, that's where the data is, so I'm going to protect that. Great, but that's got physical security controls protecting it. You know what doesn't have a lot of physical security controls protecting it? Your workstations, your developers' laptops, all right? We've seen lots of, we don't see data breaches where somebody breaks into a data center and walks off with a server, but we see data breaches and HIPAA fines all the time from just a laptop smash and grab. And you're saying, well, there shouldn't ever be PHI on those laptops. All well and good to say so, but I'll tell you, PHI is like an oil slick. It gets everywhere. You have no way of knowing what might be on, for example, one of your programmer's laptops. For all you know, yesterday was the day that your programmer had to download a CSV full of PHI and massage it with regular expressions and who knows what so that he could re-upload it back into the server. And now, without you even knowing it, there's PHI on one of your employees' workstations. Those workstations are what you should be focusing on for encryption. Encryption at rest is a great control to apply to all of the workstations in your organization. Whether or not you think they have or will have PHI on them, in my opinion, you're crazy if you don't just encrypt all of your workstations as a matter of course. Encryption is one of the few get-out-of-jail-free cards that HIPAA gives you. The loss or the theft of an encrypted device is not reportable. It's not considered a security incident. If it's not encrypted, you've got work to do. If you lose a device that's not encrypted, you've got to document that there's a low likelihood that there was any PHI on there. In fact, you really have to be able to prove a negative. You have to be able to prove that there wasn't PHI on there. That's very difficult to do. Why would you sign up for that kind of headache if you can just encrypt your workstations and forget about them? So encryption at rest, great thing on workstations, not so useful on servers and devices that are protected by physical security controls. And that's what you'll find out as you're going through the risk assessment process, when you're really looking at realistic threats and likely risks that could impact the privacy and security of data that you're holding. You're going to realize that some controls make a lot of sense. They're very quick and easy to implement. Some controls are just expensive and complicated and don't have a big bang for the buck. And so there's some of those controls you're just not going to implement, and you're going to scale back the implementation of some of those controls. And the risk assessment is where you document all of those decisions. All right. A risk assessment is supposed to document what you are doing, lead with your strengths, write down everything that you're doing right. I want you to take credit for every password, every padlock, every policy that you have in place to protect patient data at your organization. When your risk assessment uncovers opportunities for improvement, new controls that you could implement to improve security, your risk assessment, by aligning it up to business risk, prioritizes what you're going to do next. It makes your road plan and helps you make sure that you're applying your resources effectively, cost effectively. And if there are some things that just don't make sense at your organization, controls that are just overly expensive or overly complicated and just aren't really going to have an impact on mitigating risk, you justify in your risk assessment. Your risk assessment is where you justify your decision not to implement those controls because the risk is already low based on other compensating controls that you have in place for that risk. So you document what you're doing, you prioritize what you will do, and you justify what you won't do. That's what your risk assessment does for you. During a risk assessment, you identify and inventory all systems at your company. And one of the most important systems and most overlooked, especially when you look at it strictly through a technology lens, one of the most important systems is your vendor management systems. Who are the vendors and the subcontractors who you're giving access to PHI, and how are you managing those relationships? HIPAA has very specific requirements, very specific contractual requirements, and a specific contractual vehicle that HIPAA refers to as a business associate agreement. Any vendor who you're going to work with who needs access to PHI, they are considered a HIPAA business associate, and you have to have a HIPAA business associate agreement in place with that vendor. You yourself might be a business associate to your customers, and your customers, because they're sharing healthcare data with you, they're requiring you to sign a business associate agreement. So you might have upstream business associate agreements going up to your customers, and you might also have downstream business associate agreements going to your vendors and your subcontractors. So thinking about those downstream business associate agreements, the business associate agreements that you need to have in place with your vendors. Who are those vendors that need that? Well, in the software business, typically you're going to be in a cloud hosting environment or a data center, managed service, some kind of thing like that. And you're going to have a business associate agreement with those vendors. And all the big ones are prepared to offer that HIPAA business associate agreement. They offer it as a value add, and they're actively courting healthcare developers like you. So you're not going to have any problem getting a business associate agreement with those big players in the cloud storage space. You also got to have business associate agreements with technicians, any contractors, any subcontractors, contract programmers, contract DevOps experts, consultants who are, database admins who are able to get into your systems and who are able to access PHI. Don't forget your office operations. If you're working with a company to help you set up a domain controller and control all of your workstations and enforce encryption on your workstations and things like that, those companies might have access to some PHI, and you're going to need an associate agreement with them. Likewise, jumping down a little bit here, office support. If you're leasing printers, or you've got people coming in to do paper shredding, or recycling your old electronic equipment, you don't want to just throw a hard drive in the trash, right? That PHI has to be scrubbed off of that hard drive if it's not encrypted. So anybody who's helping you with that kind of stuff, you're going to need a business associate agreement. And then, of course, any kind of cloud service that you're using where PHI might come into play. Where we see this a lot with software companies is things like your issue tracking and your project management, things like that is where, if you're getting help tickets from users, is it possible that they would take a screenshot of your product and, email it to customer support for help? Could that screenshot have PHI in it? If that's a possibility, then you're going to have a business associate agreement with those cloud service providers. And sometimes you'll talk to somebody and they'll say, oh, I don't need to do a business associate agreement because I don't need to have access to your data. Doesn't matter. Even the standard is not, are they accessing your PHI? The standard is, could they access your PHI? Do they have that kind of access? Whether or not they avail themselves of that access, if they have that access, you've got to have a business associate agreement with those vendors. A business associate agreement is actually a great thing. It's a great kind of contract, and it's unique to healthcare. We don't have this kind of thing in banking or in defense industries. It's a great contract because what it actually is, it's more than just a services agreement. It's a risk transfer agreement. When you sign a business associate agreement with somebody, that business associate is agreeing to perform certain services for you, and they're agreeing to be responsible for implementing HIPAA on their side of things. They're agreeing to provide reasonable safeguards to protect that data that they're managing for you. And if they screw up, they're agreeing to be directly liable to the Department of Health and Human Services. If there's a data breach at one of your vendors and you've got a business associate agreement in place, that data breach is your vendor's problem. So a business associate agreement is a great way to package up risk and just get it outside of your organization, make it somebody else's problem. But if you don't have a business associate agreement in place, it can get very bad. So this was a situation where somebody was scheduling appointments in a cloud-based online calendar, a service that I'm sure you all know. And they were working with an organization that will sign a business associate agreement. This is an organization that, it's a company that courts healthcare, and they love providing healthcare services, and they're happy to sign a business associate agreement, but the doctors never asked for a business associate agreement. So there was a breach of patient data. The security safeguards were not put into place and were not administered correctly. And because there was not a business associate agreement in place, the liability for that breach landed squarely on the doctors. Okay, so this was because they didn't have the business associate agreement in place, they ended up being liable for the breach. That's not what you want. You want to have a business associate agreement in place so that it's your vendor's problem, it's your subcontractor's problem if anything goes wrong on their side. Now, a business associate agreement, it's not a magic document, it's just a contract. It's just a contract for services. Sometimes people have a single contract that has all of the business associate agreement requirements built into it. Sometimes there's a master services agreement and an addendum that serves as the business associate agreement addendum. You can do it either way. But the important thing, what makes a business associate agreement, is that it covers 10 key terms that are required by the Department of Health and Human Services. So if a contract or if a contract's addendum covers these 10 terms, that's what makes it a business associate agreement. So let's look at these real briefly and look at what you're getting into when you sign a business associate agreement, and look at what you're asking your vendors to take on for you when you ask them to sign a business associate agreement. First of all, here, number one and number two, it just needs to explain what's the purpose for which you're giving them access. Why are we even giving this vendor access to PHI? What's the purpose? It's to provide these specific services. And number two, they're only allowed to use it for these particular purposes. If we're giving somebody PHI access so that they can do data analysis for us, they're not permitted to sell that PHI to another company for advertising purposes, right? So what are the permitted uses and what is not permitted by the contract? Number three is what really puts you on the HIPAA hook. Number three here requires the business associate to implement appropriate safeguards, requires them to follow the HIPAA security rule with regard to PHI. So this is what, as soon as you sign a business associate agreement, you are agreeing that you're going to do a risk assessment, that you're going to follow the security rule, that you're going to implement those HIPAA implementable specifications as reasonable and appropriate, and so on. So that's the main one right there that puts you on the HIPAA hook. Number four means that if a business associate becomes aware of a data breach or a security incident, the business associate you can't just push that under the rug. You've got to report that to the covered entity. So they've got to report it back to you. Your business associates have to report breaches that happen on their watch. They're required to report those to you in a timely manner. Number 5 and 6 don't apply too often unless you're doing something really intensive, like building a whole EHR, electronic health records, for somebody. This is for organizations that are serving as the main master repository of the patient data. If you are serving as a covered entity's full designated record set, then the privacy rule means that you've got to make sure that that data is available when they need it. Most of the clients that I work with, they're not doing stuff like that. They're carving off one little solution. They've got one little solution that they offer to their clients, and some of the PHI comes in so that they can manage it or process it or do something with it. But they're not the primary custodian of that data. These 2, 5, and 6 apply when you're the primary custodian of the protected health information. Number 7 is a big one. The business associate agrees to cooperate with the Department of Health and Human Services on any kind of audit. Health and Human Services can come in, they can look at your books, your practices, they want to see your risk assessment. You're agreeing to make all of that information available to the feds and to cooperate with them on any kind of investigation like that. And that's a big one that you're signing up for when you sign a business associate agreement. Number 8, and let's go down to number 10, have to do, if when the contract terminates, you're gonna delete or destroy or return all of the protected health information. You're not going to hang on to it and do anything else with it. Number 10 means that if there is a breach, if there's and the business associate is not able to comply with its HIPAA obligations, you've got to have the right to terminate that contract. And then backing up, number 9, that's the flow through clause right there. When you sign a business associate agreement, you're agreeing that you're going to hold your subcontractors to the same requirements. All right. So if you sign a business associate agreement, you're agreeing that your vendors and your subcontractors who have access to PHI, they're going to agree to the same restrictions and conditions in a business associate agreement of their own. Now, not every vendor that you work with needs a business associate agreement. And first of all, let's be clear, employees. You do not execute a business associate agreement with employees because you can supervise employees. You should have a standard employment contract with your employees. You should have a confidentiality agreement with your employees. You should be training them on how to follow your procedures, training them how to follow the HIPAA security rule. So you can supervise them directly, no business associate agreement needed. Phone and internet providers, the post office, delivery companies, even though you may be sending a box full of PHI or transmitting PHI over the internet, those types of organizations are considered conduits under HIPAA, and there's a specific HIPAA conduit exemption that exempts phone, internet providers, and couriers. If you have contractors who have no possible access to PHI, you don't need to have a business associate agreement with them. It's only contractors or vendors who have access to PHI. So this means if you have on-premise software, you don't need to get a business associate agreement with the makers of your word processing software if they don't have access. If it's just software that you've installed and the vendor can't come in and manage your systems for you, no business associate agreement needed. They have no access. Lawyers and accountants, you can usually set up your arrangements so that they don't need access to PHI. Make sure that you don't have PHI. Make sure you don't have patient names in your accounting software, for example. That's where we sometimes see this come up. But if you set things up right, you can usually keep lawyers and accountants insulated from that. Janitorial services. If anybody's coming in to clean the office, you don't need to make those people get a business associate agreement. It's possible that as they're coming through, they'll see some PHI here and there. It's considered an incidental disclosure. They don't need that access in order to do their jobs. And as long as you're taking steps to minimize those types of incidental disclosures, they can be acceptable under HIPAA. And then something you're going to run into, something you're going to find, and it's going to be, this can make a lot of difficulties for some of our clients. You will find that some of the tools that you may already be using, some of the cloud services, some of the apps, some of the systems that you may already be using require a business associate agreement, but the vendor isn't willing or prepared to sign one. I mentioned before, we see this frequently with things like issue tracking software, project management software. I have seen data breaches caused by an employee uploading a spreadsheet full of PHI to a project management tracking system. No BAA was in place. It was a HIPAA breach. It was an impermissible disclosure that had to be investigated and mitigated at great cost. You may find that you're using some tools and you go and look and you talk to the vendor and they will not sign a business associate agreement, and you're going to have to maybe redesign some of your workflows and some of your processes to make sure that you're not disclosing PHI on a system that's not protected by a business associate agreement. If you're not sure about your vendor, it's usually pretty easy to find out. Just get into a search engine and search for the name of your vendor, and then put in HIPAA business associate agreement. And if they offer a HIPAA business associate agreement, it should be pretty easy to find. And a call to tech support or sales should help you figure that out as well. So just watch out for that. Make sure that all of the vendors and all of the services, cloud services and apps that you're using where PHI might get in, make sure you've got business associate agreements with all of them. All right, after you've launched your risk management strategy with a risk assessment, you've done your due diligence on your vendor management, you've got business associate agreements in place where they're required. The third main thing that's a big component of any HIPAA risk management strategy is policy and procedure documentation. Yeah, paperwork. And I know that it's not fun, but you also know that it's a good best practice. Even if HIPAA didn't require you to have policy and procedure documentation, I know, every business owner knows that our systems, our processes, our procedures should be documented. They should be there in writing. We want a policy and procedure manual for our companies. And HIPAA, well, HIPAA is going to make you eat your vegetables, all right? HIPAA requires you to have written policies and procedures. So look at it as a good thing. It's an opportunity to do what you always put off, what you always postpone, but you know it's the right thing to do. Document your policies and procedures. Remember, if there's an investigation, if there's a breach, auditors are going to ask for your documented policies and procedures. And also remember, it's a little bit like an audit from the IRS. You don't want to talk to an auditor. You don't want to sit down and have a chat with an auditor. What do you want to do? You want to bury them in paperwork. You want to hand them your risk assessment, all of your business associate agreements, and your full policy and procedure documentation. Hand that to them and let them come back to you with questions. Paperwork is your friend, all right? Policy and procedure documentation is your friend. Now, HIPAA does require a lot. A full HIPAA policy and procedure manual usually runs in the 150 page range. You're looking at a lot, but very few organizations can take that on all at once. Very few organizations launch with an absolutely complete and perfect and beautiful policy and procedure manual. Most of my clients take a risk management approach to this as well, and they start out by focusing on the core policies and procedures that are most important, most relevant, and aligned to the most significant risks at the organization. Start with that. A lot of my clients feel comfortable with a small kind of starter package on the policy and procedure documentation. And then as the company grows, as you keep validating your business model, as you start making some money, you invest some of that into continuous improvement, constantly working on improving your policies and procedures. So I really think that you can take an iterative approach to this, focus on the top priorities, but just commit to continuous improvement and always getting better. Here are some of the top policy priorities that I recommend for my clients. I think that these are a great place to start. They're not everything that you need for your HIPAA policies and procedures. They're not everything by any means, but these are some of the top, highest risk areas that I like to see covered in policy and procedure documentation. First of all, data classification guidelines. You should have some understanding of the different types of data that you're collecting, particularly if not all of your customers, if not all of your users are healthcare users. I've talked to a lot of people who have a product. Some of their customers are healthcare customers, some of their customers are not. That means that some of the data is PHI and some of the data is not. Perhaps the majority of your data is not actually PHI. It might look the same as PHI. It might be the same identifiers. It might be names and even social security numbers and healthcare information. But depending on how you received it, some of it might be PHI, some of it might not. You should be very clear about that in your policies and procedures. HIPAA requires us to be supervising our employees. I was talking about that. So you should have a policy for how you how you do background checks on your workforce, how you supervise your workforce, how you train them, how you hold them accountable to your policy and procedure documentation. I'd like to see a vendor management policy outlining, who gets business associate agreements and how you manage that, how you take care of that, and having, your own business associate agreement template that you have all of your vendors sign is very important. Documenting how people are given access to your systems. How do they get accounts? What level of access do they get? How do you determine who has which user roles, how much data they're able to access, and how their passwords are managed? What are your password policies at your organization? I think it's really high time for all organizations, all companies, to start providing more guidance on password management. We set up accounts for our employees and we say, go make a password, and we have no idea what kind of password they're making. And it's almost a sure bet that unless you've done some training on this, unless you have some policies and procedures on this, you have sensitive business accounts being protected by terrible passwords chosen by your employees. Password 1234 on your bank account. Terrible passwords on your cloud services, on your email, things like that. So password policies, I think, are very important. If you're permitting people to work remotely, work from home, particularly if you're permitting them to use their own devices, if they're able to use their own workstations, they're bringing their own computers in to do work, well, you need to be supervising that and requiring certain security controls in place on those workstations. For example, requiring that they have encryption at rest turned on the workstation. For example, requiring that there's a good long passphrase protecting that workstation. Email security, are people permitted to send PHI? Are you permitting your developers to email a spreadsheet full of PHI through your email systems? If you have a business associate agreement in place, might be possible, but you might decide that there are better ways of doing that. You cover that in your email security policy. Encryption and decryption, where are you applying encryption and decryption? Where are you not? This is a good policy where you can document those types of decisions. Bit more there on workstation security. What are the requirements for the workstations that your employees bring in or that you provide? And if anybody's allowed to use smartphones, and particularly their own smartphones, you need to have a BYOD policy, a bring your own device policy. If you permit that, and you probably have to permit that. It's very difficult to prohibit that. If they've got access, if they're able to use those devices to access PHI systems, you've got to have requirements and policies for what are the security controls that they've got to have in place there. Same sorts of things, encryption at rest on the device, long passcode on the device and things like that. You should be documenting that in a smartphone and BYOD policy. And then information system review, login monitoring. We talked about that in terms of logging. You should be documenting the types of logging that you've got in place and how you can respond to an accounting, a request for an accounting of disclosures. So this is a good place to start with these policy priorities at your organization. And then, of course, this is what you train to. You start, if your risk assessment uncovers your systems and documents your systems, your policies and procedures, documents that and documents how people are supposed to use those systems. And then you've got to follow that up with training. You've got to be training your employees on all of this stuff, and they've got to be able to have these policy and procedure documents to refer back to. And the training is so important because data breaches don't happen like they happen in the movies, all right? Hacking doesn't look the way hacking looks in the movies, all right? Most data breaches don't look like this, all right? Most hacking exploits don't start out with something like this, all right? A lot of HIPAA data breaches start out much stupider. They look something like this. I'm preserving this poor guy's anonymity, but this is a photograph that was published in newspapers around the country. These people made the news a couple of times. They are the missile alert system in Hawaii, and they made the news for some serious policy and procedure problems that they had. You may remember some of those news stories. And this photograph that was published in those news stories was a great illustration of some additional policy and procedure problems that they have at their organization. Do you see what I see? If you look at this with the eyes of a security researcher, a security consultant, what do you see there? Yeah, you know what that is. That's a password on a Post-it note stuck to a monitor in a photograph published in newspapers around the country. And the system that this password protects, it's called Warning Point. I don't know if you can read the blurry writing there, but the password to the Warning Point system is Warning Point 2. I don't want you to worry about national security or anything. I'm sure that they changed the password after this happened. So the password is now Warning Point 3. This is the kind of thing, this is not a technology issue. There's nothing that you can do at your data center to prevent this. This is a policy and procedure issue that you've got to take care of. And if you don't have policy and procedure documentation, and if you're not training your employees about this kind of thing, you're the one who's going to be held responsible. You're the one who's going to be held responsible for not having policies and procedures in place, not training your employees on your policies and procedures. So when employees go and do something like this, I put that guy's picture up. I kind of laugh at him, and we love to blame the user. But you know what? It's not his fault. This is a system failure. This is a system failure, and this is a leadership failure. This person was not given the tools and the training needed to protect systems, and this is the result. This is how a HIPAA data breach could happen at your organization. This is what you've got to prevent. This is what you can prevent with a risk assessment, with vendor management, with policy and procedure documentation. Remember, if you're a healthcare company, forget about the data, but if you're a healthcare company, HIPAA has more to do with your business model than it does with your data model. So make sure that you understand if you are a covered entity or if you are a business associate. Make sure you understand what kind of healthcare company you are. If you're not either one, I still recommend adopting the HIPAA security rule and following HIPAA as much as you can. Don't call yourself HIPAA compliant. That might not be true in your situation, but you can tell people that you voluntarily embrace HIPAA, that you follow the HIPAA standards. That's a good way to phrase that in your marketing materials, that you follow the HIPAA standards. You do that with good planning and documentation, with that risk assessment, with policies and procedures and all of that stuff. And it's not true that HIPAA doesn't require secure technology. Of course, it also requires secure technology. And refer back to that website that I shared with you, HIPAA.host/specs, where you can find all of the HIPAA implementable specifications. Don't think of them as a checklist, think of them as a toolbox that you can choose from and apply as reasonable and appropriate at your organization, because you're never going to be HIPAA compliant, all right? It's a marketing buzzword, it's not a real thing. HIPAA is a journey. It is not a destination. You're never going to be done with HIPAA. The environment is always changing. The threat landscape is always changing. Your systems are always changing. So HIPAA just has to become a part of the processes at your organization. You're always thinking about HIPAA. You're always thinking about security. And I talk all the time about building and fostering a security-first culture at your company. And this is how you want to lead the conversation with your users and with your customers. Security is not something that we add on afterwards. HIPAA is not an afterthought. Everything we do at our organization starts with security. We are a security-first company. That's the kind of culture that you want to build with your team. That's the kind of culture you want to explain to your users and to your customers. Make it part of your competitive advantage. Don't wait for customers to ask you about HIPAA compliance. Lead the conversation. Explain to your customers, explain to your investors. Start out in your pitch deck by explaining that you've got a HIPAA risk management program. Use the lingo. Demonstrate that you understand what you're talking about, that you're prepared, that you've got a business associate agreement, that you've got a risk assessment, that you're prepared for all of this stuff. You understand this because you're a security first company, and that is part of your competitive advantage. If you embrace HIPAA, you're way ahead of the game. Remember, HIPAA is what keeps a lot of your competition scared. HIPAA is what keeps a lot of your competitors afraid to come in and compete with you. So if you do it right, that gives you a huge head start on the people who are too nervous about HIPAA and the people who didn't take this training. You follow HIPAA, you embrace HIPAA, you make it part of your security first culture, and the sky's the limit. I'm recording this today from my office in downtown Albuquerque. It's October, it's the very beginning of balloon season here in New Mexico. And I hope that your health technology startup can soar, if not as effortlessly and as soundlessly as these hot air balloons. I hope you can soar just as high and achieve that kind of success at your health technology startup. I'm very easy to find online. My name is Michael Herrick. You can just search me, easy to find. My company is Matterform, and our program for health technology startups is called Health Tech Ignite. Reach out. Let me know if you have questions about this presentation. I'm happy to take questions, offer questions and answers. Happy to get on a phone call or a video chat, or just exchange some emails. Happy to connect on LinkedIn. Let me know how I can help you as you're building your health technology product, your health technology startup. I wish you the very best of luck, and I can't wait to see what you build.